Welcome to our channel. This is where we dive into the depths of mysterious stories, revealing the secrets of crimes and strange tales that many have not heard of. We are here to travel with you through a world of excitement and suspense, with exciting narration and wonderful visual presentations, all with a touch of humor that adds a special flavor to our content. Get ready for a journey full of mystery and excitement, where each video brings you a new and unforgettable experience. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to be the first to know everything new. Now let us begin our journey into the depths of mystery, where a new story awaits you, full of excitement and suspense. Prepare to discover secrets that only a few know, as it is time to dive into the events of this unparalleled tale. Have you ever felt like you were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape? Imagine a road, an eerie, mysterious path that leads to a place where no one ever returns. What if the price for stepping onto this road was far greater than you could ever imagine? In this chilling tale, a man named James finds himself facing the ultimate test, where every choice he makes could cost him everything he holds dear. This is not just a story of a strange road, it's a journey into the very heart of fear, sacrifice, and what happens when the line between the living and the dead becomes blurred. Join us as we explore the mysterious road that makes people disappear, a story that will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the twists and turns that lie ahead. It was a quiet evening in the small village of Larkwood, a place where the days passed slowly and the nights even slower. The village, tucked away between rolling hills and thick forests, had always been peaceful. Life was simple, and everyone knew everyone else's business. But there was one thing that had always lingered in the air, a dark secret that the villagers would never talk about openly. The road that no one dared to walk after dark. The road, called Dead Man's Path, had earned its name over the years, but few knew its origins. It wasn't long or particularly remarkable in appearance. In fact, it was a narrow dirt path, winding through the dense forest, with trees so thick that they seemed to form a canopy blocking out the sky. The road started near the edge of the village and stretched for several miles into the woods, ending at an old abandoned barn. The barn was said to be haunted, but it wasn't the barn that kept people away. It was the road itself. For as long as anyone could remember, people had disappeared on Dead Man's Path. It wasn't the usual kind of disappearance. No one simply went missing. They vanished as though they'd never existed at all. No traces, no clues, no evidence of what had happened to them. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, never willing to speak too much about it for fear that the road's curse would latch onto them. On rare occasions, someone would be brave or foolish enough to venture down the path after sunset, and they would return, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, unable to explain what they had seen or experienced. But there was always one thing they said. It wasn't just the road. Something was waiting for me, and then they would say no more. Some said it was the spirits of the long-dead villagers who haunted the path, angry souls seeking revenge. Others believed that the road itself was cursed, that it had been built upon an ancient burial ground where dark rituals had taken place. Still others whispered that the road was a portal to another world, a world where time and reality twisted and shifted. The most terrifying part of the story wasn't the idea of being lost or attacked. It was the complete disappearance. The fact that after walking the path, the person was never heard from again. The villagers spoke of a chilling phenomenon. After the person vanished, no one remembered them. Friends, family, even those who had seen them just hours before, would forget their very existence. It was as if they had been erased from time itself. The story of Dead Man's Path had been passed down through generations, and it was an unspoken rule that no one should walk there after dark. The village elders had even put up signs warning travelers to turn back if they found themselves on the path after sundown. But like any legend, some would dismiss it as mere superstition, a tale meant to keep children in line, or a way to explain the disappearances that occurred too often to be mere coincidence. But not everyone believed in the stories. A young journalist named James arrived in Larkwood one fateful autumn evening, eager to uncover the truth behind the mysterious road. James was a skeptic by nature, always looking for logical explanations and debunking myths. He had traveled to the village to write an article on local legends, hoping to expose the truth behind Dead Man's Path once and for all. James arrived at the village inn just as the sun was beginning to set. The innkeeper, an old man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much, welcomed him with a forced smile. "You're the journalist, then?" the innkeeper asked, his voice rough like gravel. "I heard you were here to investigate the old road." James nodded, brushing off the old man's cautionary tone. "That's right. I've heard the stories, but I'm not one to believe in ghost tales or curses. I'll go down the path myself and see what's really there." The innkeeper's face darkened. "You'd do well to stay away from that road after nightfall. It's not something you want to mess with." James chuckled, not taking the warning seriously. "I'll be fine. A few ghost stories aren't going to scare me." The innkeeper didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes lingering on James with an unreadable expression. "Don't say I didn't warn you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, James grabbed his camera and flashlight, eager to document the so-called haunting for his article. He made his way to the start of Dead Man's Path, the chill of the evening air brushing against his skin. The path seemed ordinary enough at first. The trees were tall and thick, their branches stretching high into the sky, forming a canopy that blocked out the last light of the day. The sounds of the village faded behind him as he walked deeper into the woods. The path was quiet, too quiet, and the further he went, the more the air seemed to grow heavier. James paused for a moment, looking around. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. He lifted his camera and began snapping pictures, feeling the thrill of being the first to uncover the truth behind the legend. But then, just as he was about to take another photo, the light from his flashlight flickered. He cursed under his breath, tapping the side of the flashlight to get it working again. But when it blinked back on, something was different. At the far end of the path, standing motionless between two trees, was a figure, a shadow, tall, dark, and unmoving. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His heart raced. He had been alone on the path, or so he thought. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching him. "Hello?" James called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. There was no response. The figure remained still, its form too indistinct to make out clearly, its features obscured by the fading light. James took a hesitant step forward, raising his camera. But as he did, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately. Step by step, it advanced toward him, its shadow growing longer as the light from his flashlight flickered again. A deep sense of unease crept over him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure was getting closer, and as it did, the air around James seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. And then, without warning, the figure stopped, right in front of him. James froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure, now standing just a few feet away, raised its hand. And then, without a sound, it vanished into the trees, leaving James standing alone in the growing darkness. James stood frozen in the middle of the road, his flashlight still flickering, casting strange shadows on the trees around him. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only an eerie silence that seemed to echo in the air. For a long moment, James couldn't move. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a person? A trick of the light? He shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was nothing more than his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, he was in the woods at night, and the mind could easily conjure up strange illusions when surrounded by darkness. But there was one thing he couldn't explain. Why hadn't the figure made a sound? No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, just silence. He glanced around once more, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air seemed to grow heavier, and the trees, once calm, now felt like silent watchers. Taking a deep breath, James forced himself to move forward. He needed to finish his investigation. He needed to get answers. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but he couldn't allow it to deter him. The truth about Dead Man's Path was waiting to be uncovered, and he wasn't about to turn back now. The path twisted deeper into the woods, the trees growing taller and denser. The only light now came from his flashlight, which seemed to weaken with every step. He checked his watch. 11:30 p.m. He still had time before the night was over. The village was far behind him, and there was no one around for miles. The silence of the woods was oppressive, as if nature itself was holding its breath. As James walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, the darkness seemed to shift. But when he turned around, there was nothing, only the shadows, stretching long and deep across the forest floor. He heard it then, a soft sound, barely audible over the rustling of the trees. A whisper. It came from the direction he had just passed. "James?" He stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold. The whisper had been unmistakable, his name echoing through the trees. He wasn't alone. Slowly, James turned back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He scanned the darkness, but there was no sign of the figure. The whisper had been too clear, too familiar. He took another step back, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever had spoken. The whisper came again, louder this time. "James, don't go further." His heart raced. It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading. But it wasn't like any voice he had ever heard before. It was wrong. The sound was hollow, distant, as though it was coming from a place far beyond this world. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't want to keep moving. He wanted to run back to the village, back to safety. But something in the voice, something in the warning, pulled him forward. What could be so terrible ahead? Ignoring the growing panic in his chest, James continued walking, determined to finish what he had started. The whisper faded, but the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. The trees ahead began to thin out, and the path curved toward a small clearing. There, standing like an ancient sentinel, was an old iron gate. It was rusted, twisted, and half buried under creeping vines. Beyond the gate, a crumbling stone wall stretched out into the darkness, surrounding what appeared to be an abandoned building. James approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the eerie sight. This was the place, the end of the road, the abandoned barn that had always been the focal point of the legend. He stepped closer to the gate, his fingers brushing against the cold, weathered iron. It groaned under his touch, as if protesting his intrusion. But James wasn't deterred. This was where the story ended, the key to understanding the mystery of Dead Man's Path. Just as he was about to push the gate open, something caught his eye, a movement. In the shadows of the barn, something shifted. It was quick, almost too fast to see, but there was no mistaking it. A figure, standing in the darkness. James's heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching him. And then, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more distinct, echoing through the trees like a warning. "Leave this place, now!" James' blood ran cold. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to run. But the curiosity that had driven him this far held him in place. He had come to find the truth, and he wasn't about to leave without it. Summoning all his courage, James pushed open the gate with a loud creak. As soon as it swung open, a gust of wind rushed past him, cold and sharp, carrying with it a faint scent of decay. He stepped forward, the flashlight casting an eerie glow on the barn ahead. The figure in the distance didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. With his breath coming in shallow gasps, James moved toward the barn, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air around him grew colder, the darkness deeper. The barn loomed ahead, its broken windows staring at him like hollow eyes. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from within the barn. James froze. The figure was gone, replaced by the sound of something or someone moving inside. He stood motionless, listening, every muscle in his body tense. The silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of the forest. This was the silence before a storm, the kind that made your skin crawl. Then a voice, not from the shadows, but from behind him. "James!" He whipped around, but there was no one there. The path behind him was empty. The road stretched back into the darkness, the village just a distant memory. The road was now a different place, an unfamiliar path. James's mind spun with confusion. Had he lost track of time? Had he wandered too far? What was going on? Before he could answer his own questions, the ground beneath him shifted. The path ahead seemed to stretch further into the darkness, impossibly long, like it was pulling him in. The trees, the barn, everything around him seemed to warp and twist. The road was changing, moving. And then, the voice came again, louder this time, not from behind him, but from the very air around him. "Leave, before it's too late." James turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. But no matter how fast he moved, the path seemed to stretch out before him, never ending, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The further he ran, the more the road seemed to shift until he could no longer tell where he was, whether he was on Dead Man's Path or somewhere far worse. James didn't stop running. His legs burned, his chest heaved with every breath. But no matter how fast he moved, the road stretched before him, an endless loop that refused to end. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, as if trying to drag him back into the depths of the forest. He had to get out. He had to escape before it was too late. But where was the exit? With every step, the woods seemed to swallow him deeper. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure that had been watching him earlier. But there was nothing, only darkness, thick and suffocating. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him, a faint whisper carried by the wind. His heart skipped a beat. "James." The voice was softer now, almost a plea, but it still sent chills racing down his spine. He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was no one there. Just the same dark path stretching endlessly before him. He stopped in his tracks, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep running. The fear, the exhaustion, it was too much to bear. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening before he lost himself completely in this cursed place. As if answering his silent plea, the air around him shifted. The path before him seemed to distort, the trees bending unnaturally, the shadows growing longer. The world around him was warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. Then, as though the forest itself had heard his thoughts, the path before him cleared. There, in the distance, was something he hadn't expected to see. An old, decrepit house. Its walls were crumbling, and its roof had long since collapsed. But it was a structure, a place that seemed to hold some kind of secret. It was his only option. James staggered toward the house, the ground beneath him feeling strange, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath his feet. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into the heart of the unknown, the house growing larger and more imposing as he approached. The closer he got, the more oppressive the air became. It felt thick, heavy, as though the house was suffocating him. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He could almost hear the whispers again, but this time they were louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices trying to warn him. But it was too late. He reached the door, its wood warped and rotting. With a trembling hand, he pushed it open. The door creaked, as if protesting his intrusion, but it gave way, revealing the dark interior of the house. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows across the room. The house seemed frozen in time, as though it had been abandoned decades ago. But there was something strange about it, something that didn't feel entirely abandoned. James moved cautiously, his every sense heightened. The whispers seemed to echo around him, growing louder with each step he took. He entered what appeared to be a living room, its furniture covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. But in the center of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror. It was cracked, the glass shattered in places, but it still stood tall and imposing. For reasons he couldn't explain, James felt drawn to the mirror. His eyes locked onto the shattered surface, and as he gazed into it, something strange began to happen. The reflection wasn't just his own. There was something else there, something that didn't belong, a face. It wasn't clear at first. The image was distorted, as if it was trying to break free from the glass. But then slowly, the face became clearer. A woman's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes hollow and black, staring back at him. Her mouth moved, but no sound came from it. "Help me," the voice whispered, echoing in James's mind. He could feel the words inside his head, like they were part of him, part of the house. James stumbled back, his heart racing. He spun around, his breath coming in short gasps. The house felt alive now, the air vibrating with an energy he couldn't explain. The whispers were everywhere, swirling around him, filling his ears. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, louder this time. James backed away, his mind reeling. He had to leave. He had to get out of this house before it consumed him too. But as he turned to the door, he froze. The doorway had disappeared. The walls had closed in, and the house was no longer a house. It was a maze. The hallway stretched out in front of him, dark and endless, twisting in impossible directions. The only sound was the distant whispering, growing louder, more frantic. "James!" It was the same voice, but now it was mixed with others. Dozens of voices, all calling his name in unison. He ran down the hallway, desperate to escape, but every turn led to another dead end. The walls seemed to shift with each step, trapping him in a never-ending labyrinth. He was lost, completely lost, and the voices were closing in on him. Then in the distance, he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, the same figure he had seen before, the one that had been watching him on Dead Man's Path. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was solid, real, and its eyes were burning with an unnatural light. The figure began to move toward him, slowly, deliberately. James's blood ran cold. He tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The figure was getting closer, and the voices were growing louder, drowning out everything else. And then, just as the figure reached out to grab him, everything stopped. The house went silent. James blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, he was back on the path. The trees stood still, the road stretched out before him, and the figure was gone. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the house, the voices, and the figure were nothing more than a terrible dream. But James knew better. He wasn't dreaming. He had just crossed over into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The road had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. And now there was no escape. James stood frozen at the end of the path, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around him felt like it was shifting, twisting, as if the very air was alive with unseen forces. His heart was pounding in his chest, and every muscle in his body screamed at him to run. But his feet felt as though they were stuck in place, unable to move, as the road stretched out before him like an endless, unbreakable chain. The whispers were still there, echoing in the back of his mind, filling his thoughts with dread. They were no longer just voices. They were a presence, a weight that pressed down on him, pulling him into the darkness. Why had he come here? What was he trying to prove? James had no answers. He could feel his sanity slipping away, piece by piece, as the night seemed to stretch on forever. The woods around him had become a maze, a labyrinth that had no beginning or end, and now he was trapped in it. But before he could process his thoughts any further, a sudden movement caught his eye. He turned, and there, standing at the edge of the path, was the same figure. The figure that had watched him from the shadows of the barn. The figure that had haunted his every step since he set foot on Dead Man's Path. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, tall and thin, draped in tattered clothes that hung from his frame like a shroud. His face was hidden by a hood, but the faint outline of his features was visible in the moonlight. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were two dark, hollow pits that seemed to suck in the very light around them. James could feel the weight of the figure's gaze even from a distance. It was as though the man was looking directly into his soul, reading every fear, every doubt, every regret he had ever experienced. And yet, despite the intense pressure in the air, the figure did not move. The silence between them was deafening. It was as if the entire world had stopped, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. James tried to speak, to ask who the man was, but no words came. His mouth was dry, his throat tight with fear. Suddenly, the figure's lips moved. The words were barely audible at first, just a whisper in the wind. but they cut through the silence like a knife. "You shouldn't be here." James took a step back, his heart racing. The voice was cold, emotionless, as if it came from somewhere far beyond this world. There was no warmth in it, no humanity, just an endless void. The figure took a step forward, its movement unnaturally smooth, as if it glided across the ground rather than walking. With each step, the distance between them closed, and James could feel the oppressive weight of the figure's presence growing heavier. "I warned you," the voice continued louder this time. "Curiosity has a price." James opened his mouth to speak, to ask what the figure meant, but before he could utter a word, the man lifted a hand. A sudden, sharp pain shot through James' chest, as though something had pierced his heart. He gasped for air, but his lungs seemed to betray him, unable to draw in enough oxygen. His body jerked violently, and he collapsed to his knees, unable to move. The figure was standing over him now, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made James's skin crawl. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the whispers had grown louder, becoming a cacophony of voices screaming in his ears. "This road," the figure said, "is not meant to be walked by the living. It belongs to the lost, the forgotten. Those who wander too far are never seen again." James could barely hear the words over the pounding in his ears. He could feel his body growing weaker with every passing second, the cold spreading through his limbs like ice. But his mind, fueled by the last remnants of his will, fought to stay awake, to understand. What do you want?" James croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure leaned down, its face now inches from his own. James could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, against his skin. And then, in a voice that was so cold, so detached, that it sent a chill straight through his soul, the figure spoke again. "The road has claimed many souls before you. You were never meant to escape. Your curiosity has led you here, to the place where time and death meet. The path you walked was not made for you, and now you belong to it." A cold, sickening laugh echoed through the woods, as if the figure was not alone. James's vision blurred, and his body began to tremble uncontrollably. He could feel his consciousness slipping away, his thoughts becoming a distant echo. But just as the darkness began to swallow him whole, something shifted. A light, a faint glowing light, appeared in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was enough to cut through the suffocating darkness, enough to remind James that there was still hope. He tried to move toward the light, but his body was too weak. The figure was still standing over him, its hand outstretched as if to claim him. "No one escapes," the figure whispered. "Not even you." James's hand stretched out, desperate to reach the light. His vision swam, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. But in that moment, when everything seemed lost, he heard a voice, a familiar voice. "James, get up!" It was the voice of a woman, soft, gentle, yet firm, and it was coming from the light. James mustered all his strength, and with every ounce of willpower he had left, he crawled toward the light. His body screamed in protest, his limbs trembling with exhaustion, but the voice continued to call him, urging him forward. With one final, desperate push, he reached the light, and then everything went black. James awoke with a start, gasping for air, his body drenched in cold sweat. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind was a swirling mess of confusion. For a moment, he had no idea where he was. The last thing he remembered was crawling toward the light, his body on the brink of collapse. But now, he was no longer on the cursed road. He blinked, trying to focus, and as his vision cleared, he realized he was lying on the ground, surrounded by tall, shadowy trees. The same twisted trees from before, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. But there was something different this time. The air felt heavier, thick with a sense of dread that seemed to suffocate everything around him. The woods were eerily silent. No whispers, no voices. Only the distant sound of wind rustling through the leaves. James sat up, his body aching as if he had been lying there for hours. He looked around, trying to get his bearings, but nothing looked familiar. The road was gone. The house, the figure, the labyrinth, everything had disappeared. In its place was just an endless stretch of dark, dense forest. Had he escaped? Or was he still trapped in the nightmare? As he stood, his legs trembling beneath him, James noticed something strange in the distance. A flicker of light, far off between the trees. It wasn't the warm glow of a campfire or the headlights of a car. No, this light was colder, almost otherworldly, like a beacon calling him. The instinct to run, to get out of here, almost overtook him. But something about that light, something in his gut told him that he had to go toward it. It was his only chance. James took a hesitant step forward, then another, and soon he was walking faster, his pace quickening with each passing moment. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in on him, the trees growing thicker and taller as if they were trying to keep him from reaching the light. The air felt charged with energy now, crackling like static, and James couldn't help but feel that something was watching him. But this time, it wasn't just the oppressive silence of the forest, it was something else, something alive, something that knew exactly where he was, what he was doing. As he neared the light, a figure emerged from the shadows, the same figure from before, the tall, hooded man. His presence was as suffocating as ever, but this time, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching James with those empty, dark eyes. "What do you want from me?" James found his voice, though it trembled with fear. The figure didn't answer at first. Instead, it simply stepped aside, revealing the source of the light. A stone archway, ancient and covered in vines, its surface glowing with an eerie, ethereal light. The archway stood in the middle of the forest, completely out of place in this desolate landscape. James couldn't take his eyes off it. There was something hypnotic about the light, something that pulled him in, urging him to step through. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had no choice, like it was his only chance to escape whatever nightmare he had found himself in. But as his hand reached out to touch the stone, a cold voice stopped him in his tracks. "Before you cross, you must understand one thing." James turned toward the figure, his heart racing in his chest. The hooded man had spoken, and this time his voice was colder than ever, more sinister. "This path," the figure continued, "is a place of choices. Each one who passes through the arch must leave something behind. A memory, a piece of their soul, a part of their very being. The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice to escape?" James's throat went dry. He had heard of choices before, life-changing ones, but this was different. He had already lost so much, his sanity, his sense of reality, and now it seemed like he had to lose something more. He glanced back at the archway, the light glowing brighter now, almost blinding him with its unnatural intensity. It was his escape, his way out. But at what cost? I don't know what you mean," James stammered, shaking his head. "I just want to leave. I want to get out of here." The figure's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "Everyone who steps through must choose, and when you make your choice, there's no turning back, no second chances." The weight of the figure's words hit James like a physical blow. No turning back. It was a truth he didn't want to face. But deep down, he knew the figure wasn't lying. There was no escaping this, no simple way out. James looked at the arch again, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pull, the pressure to step forward, to take that leap of faith. But the fear gripped him, chaining him to the spot. What if the choice he made was the wrong one? What if the price he paid was too high? The figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the ground like a dark omen. "Time is running out, James. The road you've walked will not let you go so easily. You must choose, now." James' mind raced. He thought of everything he had lost, his peace, his safety, his sanity. He thought of the people he loved, the life he once had. Was it worth sacrificing more of himself just to escape? But what was the alternative? With one last desperate glance at the arch, James took a deep breath. He had no choice. He stepped forward, and as his foot crossed the threshold of the archway, the world around him shattered. The moment James stepped through the archway, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He could feel the ground beneath him tremble, as if the very earth itself was rejecting his presence. The air grew thick with an almost unbearable pressure. and the light from the archway faded behind him like a memory slipping away. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Absolute silence surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face, nor hear his own breath. It felt like he was suspended in some vast, empty space, detached from time and reality. But then, a voice broke the silence. "You have crossed, James, and now the cost is yours to bear." The voice was low, cold, and filled with an ominous finality. James froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He recognized it. It was the same voice that had warned him before, the voice of the figure in the forest. He looked around, but there was nothing to see. No figure, no forest, no light. Just an infinite void. What? What do you mean?" James whispered, his voice trembling. "What cost? I don't understand." The air seemed to ripple as the voice spoke again, this time louder, more forceful. "The cost of your escape is the life you left behind. Every choice, every action, every moment you lived before you crossed the threshold, everything is now lost to you." James' breath caught in his throat. Lost to him, the world he knew, the people he loved, the memories of his life, all of it. He wanted to scream, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. His chest tightened with a heavy, suffocating weight. He tried to call out for help, but no one responded. It was as if the very fabric of reality had torn itself apart, leaving him in a cold, empty void. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the voice spoke again, this time with a cruel edge. "You will never return to your old life, James. You are here in this place because you chose it, and now you will face the consequences." Suddenly, the world around him shifted. The void faded, replaced by a blur of colors and lights. James's vision swam, and he felt as though he were falling, spiraling through a tunnel, the walls closing in on him from all sides. He could hear faint whispers, distant voices calling his name. They sounded familiar, like echoes from his past. But as the voices grew louder, they began to distort, turning into agonized cries, desperate pleas, and a sense of overwhelming loss. "James!" He opened his eyes and found himself standing in the middle of a vast, barren landscape. The ground was cracked and dry, stretching out endlessly in every direction. The sky above was a sickly shade of purple, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural energy. And then he saw it. In the distance, there was a figure standing alone, silhouetted against the strange, twisted sky. It was a woman. He could tell by the shape of her silhouette, the curve of her body. She was standing perfectly still, as though waiting for him. James took a step forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. He wanted to call out to her, to run toward her, but something held him back. The air around him was heavy with an indescribable tension, and every step he took felt like he was walking through thick, sticky mud. When he finally reached her, his heart skipped a beat. The woman's face was obscured by a veil of shadows, her features hidden from view. She stood motionless, her hands at her sides, as if waiting for him to make the next move. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. She simply raised her hand, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The ground beneath James's feet began to tremble, and the sky overhead grew darker, swirling into a violent storm. The figure's hand glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, and as she moved it, the world around James shifted again. The barren landscape twisted and warped, and in its place, the image of his old home materialized. His house, his room, his familiar surroundings. For a fleeting moment, James thought he was back. He was home. He was safe. But as he reached out to touch the door, something stopped him. The door wasn't real. It was just an illusion, a projection of his memories. His hand passed right through it, and as he withdrew, he saw something he wasn't ready to see. Inside, the house was empty, desolate. It was as if everything he had known, every person he had loved, had disappeared, erased from existence. The woman's voice finally broke through the silence. "This is what you have lost, James. Everything you left behind, everything you took for granted, is now gone. The life you knew is a shadow, a fleeting memory." James fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. His heart was heavy with grief. But more than that, he felt nothing. His emotions were hollow, empty. The people he had cared for, the experiences he had lived through, they were nothing more than ghosts fading away into oblivion. The woman took a step closer, her presence both comforting and terrifying at the same time. But you can still make a choice. You can choose to forget everything you've lost, or you can carry the burden with you forever. The road you walked was never just about escape, James. It was about what you were willing to give up to get out. James stared at her, unable to speak. The truth was too overwhelming, too much for him to process. Everything he had ever known, his past, his identity, his relationships, was now beyond his reach. "What will you choose?" she asked. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. Would he embrace the emptiness and forget everything? Or would he carry the burden of his past with him forever? The choice, as always, was his. James stood frozen, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His mind raced, spinning between the agony of his past and the uncertainty of his future. His heart felt like it was being torn apart by the reality he had just witnessed. The life he had left behind was gone. His memories, his connections, his identity. Everything had vanished, reduced to a mere shadow of what it once was. He turned back to the woman, the figure who had led him through this twisted, distorted world. Her face remained obscured, hidden behind the veil of shadows, but her presence was undeniable, powerful and cold, yet strangely comforting. "What am I supposed to do now?" James whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "What's left for me?" The woman's expression softened, though James could not see it beneath the shadows. She took a step closer, her voice carrying an unusual calmness, as if she had seen this moment unfold countless times before. "What's left for you, James, is the choice that defines you. You've already left behind what you loved. You've crossed a line, but now you must decide whether to remain in this place. A place where time is lost and nothing can truly be regained, or to return, to face the life that awaits you, knowing that it will never be the same." James felt a chill run down his spine. The very idea of returning to his old life, if that was even possible, filled him with dread. He could never go back to what he once knew, not after what he had experienced. But was that the right choice? To stay here, in this endless limbo of empty memories and unfulfilled desires? He glanced at the twisted landscape around him, the barren land, the eerie purple sky, the endless void of lost time. It was all a reflection of his shattered mind, his fractured soul. And then, from somewhere deep within, he felt something stir, a flicker of hope, a spark of desire to fight, to live again. His gaze shifted back to the woman. "What's the point of returning? What if I'm just chasing a lost dream?" The woman remained silent for a moment, then spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the deepest corners of his mind. "The point, James, is that you still have a choice. Even now, after everything, you can choose what you carry with you. Will it be the ghosts of your past or the strength to rebuild? Will you be defined by what you lost or by what you still have left?" Her words resonated deep within him, like a distant call that urged him to find the courage to choose. James closed his eyes, taking a slow, steady breath. He thought of his family, his friends, people he could no longer remember clearly, but knew in his heart he had loved deeply. He thought of the life he had once taken for granted, the simple joys of everyday existence. Was it worth giving up everything for the chance to escape? Or had he already paid the price, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions? The shadows around him seemed to close in, but then something changed. The air shifted, and for the first time since he had crossed the arch, James felt a surge of warmth, a glimmer of light in the dark. He could hear something, distant but unmistakable, the sound of laughter. Familiar voices calling his name, echoing from the past. In that moment, he realized something he had been too afraid to admit. He wasn't alone. The people he loved, his past, his memories, they weren't truly gone. They lived within him, in the very essence of who he was. It wasn't the road that defined him, nor the choices that had led him to this point. It was the strength to move forward, to embrace what he still had, and to rebuild what had been lost. James looked at the woman one final time. Her form began to fade, her presence slipping away like mist in the morning sun. Her voice, though, lingered in his ears. "You have made your choice, James. But remember this, the road never truly ends. The journey is yours to continue, no matter where it takes you." The world around him began to shift again. The barren land dissolved, replaced by the familiar sights of his old home. But it wasn't just the house that had returned. It was everything he had lost, slowly beginning to piece itself back together. His memories, his life, his sense of self, it was all coming back. And with it, the knowledge that he would never be the same again. James took a step forward, feeling the ground firm beneath his feet. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The road that had led him here was not the end, but a beginning, a new chapter in a story that was his to write. He had chosen to live. And as he walked away from the woman, who was now nothing more than a fading memory, James knew that no matter where the road would take him next, he would never forget the price of his escape. Thank you for watching, and if you like strange and exciting stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the alert bell to get everything that is out of the ordinary. If you have experiences or opinions, share them with us in the comments. Always be ready for the unexpected and buy in the next story if you dare to hear it.